So again, it'll probably blend with other elements. One of the elements that may very easily blend with magic realism is the genre of post-colonialism. So that tends to consider the effect of globalisation and of the West on other cultures, especially those where colonial powers have left and there is now some sort of culture clash, or there is worse, a culture vacuum, and people are not sure how to behave anymore. So this considers notions of identity and belonging, often referencing traditional languages or practices. So places you can think about, obviously in terms of English colonisation, you'd be looking at India and Sri Lanka and Australia as well, so Australian Aborigines. And you could also be thinking about Dutch colonisation of Indonesia and places like that, and the sort of bizarre conflicts that come up because of this. Some great post-colonial texts include The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, which is set in post-colonial India and looks at the strain on one family, which includes things like murders and suicides and all sorts of trouble, due to the vacuum left by the English retreating. And there's also the black comedy Vernon God Little by DBC Pierre, which is ostensibly about a school shooting in America. The main character is accused of the shooting, but actually is innocent. He goes on the run, and he ends up being picked up by the police and is in jail and becomes a member of a reality TV show where you can vote to have your favourite convict set free. So obviously this kind of text is supposed to be pretty much making fun of the USA and Western style living in general. And both of the texts try and look at the damage that can be done by global movements. So both of those will make really good additional material, particularly for things like belonging. Another confusing genre we have to look at is metafiction. So this is basically a type of text with an awareness about books or writing. So it's a book that's self-conscious of itself. So the characters may know that they are in a book, or the plot might move backwards and so break a whole bunch of literary conventions, or it might remind you of the inconsistencies between real life and how it is presented in fiction. So often in fiction, a life is presented, they're born, they grow up, a bunch of interesting things happen to them and they die, and that's the end of the book. Or the most interesting thing happens and then the story ends. But in real life, you might, something interesting might happen to you today, 3 months might pass and nothing interesting happens at all, and then, the most exciting day of your life might happen, but you're probably going to keep living after that, so that's not going to be where the end of the story is. So basically what metafiction tries to show us is that the way we represent life in fiction has very little to do with reality, and it can kind of be harmful to think of our real lives as though they're going to take place like a story in a book. So to look at this, the most famous writer of metafiction is probably Italo Calvino, whose book If on a Winter's Night a Traveller is actually told in the second person. So it's like you are in a bookstore, you turn left and you see, whatever. So it really involves the reader in the story as though they're personally part of it. So in If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, you begin in a bookstore, but you soon discover that the book you're reading, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, is actually incorrectly printed. So each chapter in your story is actually the beginning of an entirely new book. So again, it plays around with the idea that stories don't necessarily finish, that there can be errors and mistakes, and again asks you to think about what is real and what is fake. Another worthwhile genre to think about is the minority reading of other texts. So postmodernism sometimes enjoys subverting classic texts by either investigating or swapping gender roles, or taking the perspective of a minority. So you might go back and take one of your favourite classic books and rewrite it from the perspective of a woman, or maybe from the perspective of an Asian or African person if the story was originally told from a Western point of view. Minority readings consider gender, sexuality, race, class, disability, and other points of view that were commonly overlooked in traditional earlier texts. So a great example of this is the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. And what happens here is that we take the original classic Greek story, the Odyssey, which is about one man travelling home from the Trojan War, and because he's angered the gods, it actually takes him 30 years to get home to Ithaca and his wife. But instead of telling the story from Odysseus' viewpoint, it retells it from the viewpoint of his faithful, long-suffering wife, who has to wait for him for 30 years on Ithaca. So that kind of literature, you can see, really makes you think about the voices that aren't included, and often, particularly in early Western literature, women's points of view are really left out. The final genre we're going to have a look at is grunge fiction. So it's also known as gritty realism, and it tends to focus on the unpleasant aspects of reality. So like metafiction that says that we kind of paper over, the inconsistencies in life and try and make it into a neat, clean-cut story. Grunge fiction tries to focus on the things that might have been ignored in, say, a Victorian book. So if you pick up a Charles Dickens book, there's never a description of anyone going to the toilet because it's just considered not proper or appropriate to talk about. But grunge fiction is entirely about those bits that we try not to talk about. So it's things like immorality, laziness, cheap sex, drug addiction, bodily functions, and often features young nihilistic protagonists in really grungy urban settings. So it's often about the most unpleasant parts of life, and often deals with things like drugs and disease. So good examples of grunge fiction include Trainspotting by Irving Welsh and Praise by the Australian author Andrew McGowan. So both of those would make great additional material. You might have a bit of a hard time reading Trainspotting at first because it's actually written in Scottish. It's trying to emulate a Scottish accent, and it uses a lot of regional slang and a lot of swearing as well, actually. So it can be really hard to kind of understand what's going on at first. But once you get into it, you're sort of like, oh, is this really literature? But it actually is. They're really good stories, but they're just presenting a very different view to kind of the commonly held view of what high art is. So what do you do if you have to write like a postmodernist? Well, it's a bit of a tall order because obviously, as we've said, there are a whole bunch of different genres in Pomo, and they all have kind of their own styles and their own techniques. So really what would be better to do is to pick just one that you'd like to write in, read an example text of that style, and then kind of try and emulate or copy it to a certain degree until you feel like you understand what you're doing. So if you're thinking of things to generally talk about, most postmodernist literature is going to have a subjective voice in first person, so someone who doesn't know the truth but has kind of remembered something. Possibly an unreliable or a limited narrator. So what we mean by this is a narrator that doesn't know the whole story so they can't tell it, or perhaps even someone who's like a pathological liar and doesn't want to tell you the whole story, so you're only getting glimpses of what might really have happened behind their point of view. You'll also find it's common that rather than telling us directly which character is saying which, the dialogue will be marked with just a dash, and so you have to kind of keep up with the conversation as though you were overhearing it or eavesdropping. And there's often a heavy use of motif. So there'll be a lot of little symbols throughout the book that are sort of very sparsely mentioned, but it's up to you to kind of notice those symbols and interpret them, and that will often help you understand what the true message or theme of the book is about. So some good ones to try and emulate. If you want to pick an early postmodernist one, try an absurdist dialogue. It will be difficult, but it's also often a lot of fun. You pick two characters, you have to think about the kind of things they're going to be arguing about, the questions that they're not going to answer, the mishearings and the puns. So it might even be good to read a little bit of Waiting for Godot, which you can find freely available online, before you start trying to write it. Another thing you might try is a post-colonial narrative. So imagining the point of view of an Australian Aborigine, or maybe someone from Sri Lanka and talking about their point of view. Or even a gender subversion text where you pick a classical tale and try and retell it. So you might pick your favorite story and then think of how would this be different if it was retold from a Ugandan perspective, or from the perspective of a woman, or that sort of thing. So those would make really good practice exercises. But generally the rule with postmodernism is read a little bit first before you start writing. So what should you read? Well, if you want to get a good idea of existentialism and even absurdism, you could read The Stranger by Albert Camus, but it will probably be a bit of a head trip and it may be a bit difficult for you. Waiting for Godot is definitely worthwhile. It will be confusing, but absurdism is supposed to be confusing. So you're not wrong if you don't understand what's going on. That's what's supposed to happen. So you could try Waiting for Godot or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Obviously the second one's going to make more sense if you've ever seen Hamlet though. 100 Years of Solitude is definitely worthwhile and would make great additional material, as would The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy and Vernon God Little. Vernon God Little is probably going to be the easiest to read on this list because it's written from the point of view of a 16-year-old, so it's probably very easily relatable. If On a Winter's Night a Traveller, some people find kind of frustrating because just when they're settling into the story, it changes to a different book. But it's definitely worthwhile, if only to get a good understanding of metafiction. The Peloponnesiad will make great additional material as well. And Trainspotting and Praise, once you've gotten past the kind of crazy language, are both going to make really good additional material as well.